then. All right, so first of all, my name is Arlene Triolo. Okay, I'm a mother of 3 daughters between the age of 4 months and 6 years. I formerly trained as an attorney, and then I retrained to become a health coach and then a functional medicine health consultant. And my accent is a little bit strange. You might have already discovered that's because I've lived many different places. I was actually born in Germany, and then I moved to Scotland, which is where I spent most of my life. Got married there, then moved to Singapore, then Paris, France, and now I live in sunny South Carolina. So that's why my accent will probably go all over the place during the course of this talk as well. And I've helped people with night eating syndrome for about 6 years now. And the reason I started doing coaching with night eating syndrome is because I suffered from it myself for about a decade. And at that time, it was from 2019 to about 2019, and we're 8 years on. And during that time, there was really very little help out there. We were just talking earlier about there being just one support group, and that support group really didn't have that much information out there about night eating syndrome. There was one other book that I read, and really that book was very pitiful because it talked about all these experiments that they did, but they never gave you a solution to the steps that you need to take in order to overcome night eating syndrome. And so I knew that if I was ever able to overcome it, which honestly I doubted a lot of the time, I just really wanted to help other people overcome night eating syndrome in some capacity as well. So I ended up through a lot of trial and error, seeing doctors and therapists who usually just told me to stop it, or who told me that, I need to take more medicines, take sleep medicines to just knock me out during the night. I ended up just giving in, taking those medicines. It didn't work, or I tried myself to stop it, through locks on the cabinets, locks on the fridge. I tried pretty much everything. I tried all sorts of different diets, from vegan to keto, all of those things. And honestly, eventually it was kind of like through trial and error and just understanding more about my body and how my physiology works, and largely as well through the training that I did as a functional medicine health consultant, even though there wasn't specifically a chapter on night eating, but it did help knowing more about my body and about how it works. That helped me eventually overcome night eating syndrome. And so once I was about free for 6 months, I was like, wow, I was just amazed by just how amazing it felt to finally be free from night eating. Because as we said earlier, it just puts such a toll, not just on your nights, but on the mornings when you wake up. So much of your night is so much of your day is consumed by this thought of, am I going to night eat again? As I'm sure many of you know. And so I actually launched a pilot group back in the original NES group. I launched a pilot group, and about 9 people joined the pilot group, where I took them through a 12-week coaching. And I had some success with the people that were there. One of the ladies actually managed to fully overcome her night eating syndrome. And at the time, my strategies were very rudimentary, but I just kind of told her all the things that I was doing to help myself overcome night eating. And then I began speaking about it more and more on my Instagram as well. And people just trickled in needing help with night eating syndrome. So over the course of 6 years, I have helped many people. I've had the honor of helping many people who've come to me with their challenges. And it's been a really redeeming and rewarding part of my life, just to see people gain that freedom that they never thought would be possible. So that's enough about me, but I just wanted to take you back to my journey a little bit. And so today, I really want to share 3 things that I think everybody suffering from night eating syndrome should know and must know in order to overcome it. And so the first thing I like to call the stages of recovery. So having worked with people for a number of years, I always see that people go through 6 different stages of recovery. People usually, or initially when they come to me, they think, what are the 5 things, or what are the 10 things that I need to do to just flip off this switch? But we rarely see night eating being resolved overnight or by itself at the flip of a switch. Usually it takes people about 5 to 10 years to realize that that doesn't happen. And that is why a lot of times people are just in their night eating habit for such a long time. So as I said, what I usually see is these 6 stages of recovery, and I'm going to talk you through them. But the point of these stages is that celebrating the small successes of moving through stage 1 to stage 6 actually helps to rewire your brain for recovery. So it helps build and keep the consistent habits that you need in order to overcome night eating syndrome and to see real results along the way. So what I mean by that is some of the stages, as I'll take you through them, is you might still be night eating, but you might have more control over your night eating. And that is something to be celebrated. And that is you moving closer to recovery. But recovery is rarely a straight line. It's much more like a twisty mountain path. So it's always important to keep your eyes on what stage of recovery you're in order for you to be able to keep those habits up consistently that will eventually lead you to freedom. So let me talk you guys through the stages of recovery. So stage number one is what I call the total lack of control stage. So this is usually where people start out. So this is when you have a total lack of control and there's no choice. You wake up every night, once or multiple times a night, to eat something. Often you only realize you're eating after you started eating. You're eating upwards of 1,000, maybe 1,500 calories, and you may also be eating most of your calories after dinner and before bedtime. Stage number 2 is when you develop a slight awareness. You wake up immediately and think of eating, and there's some awareness and choice around eating in the middle of the night. But you often feel justified in eating, saying that you need the food in order to go back to sleep. There is a choice, but more often than not, the urge is too overwhelming, and you can't help but eat something in order to suppress that urge. At this stage, people usually eat about 600 to 1,500 calories. Stage 3 is where you have slightly more control, okay? The fewer calorie stage, I call this. You wake up and you still have an urge to eat, and you still choose to night eat every time you wake up, but now you have some control over what you are eating. You're able to go to bed after eating fewer calories, usually around 200 to 500 calories. And often you're able to choose healthier things. So you are choosing a slice of cheese versus ice cream, or you're choosing a piece of fruit versus a packet of cookies. Stage 4 is when the urge becomes slightly less controlling, and you are able to stay in bed some of the time and endure the night eating feelings. But a lot of times the urge is still overwhelming and you're having to exercise too much willpower. And so some of the time you still get up and night eat. The feelings are still really strong, and usually a person manages to go 2 or 3 day stretches without night eating. But other times you still fail because the willpower element is too strong. Stage 5, I call this the weak urge stage. So here the urge of night eating has become weak and more like a fleeting thought rather than a controlling urge. As a result, you have little desire to night eat and you rarely get up to night eat, but occasionally it still happens. And when it does, you move on without criticism and you go about your normal day-to-day life. And then stage 6 is the recovery, the freedom stage. This is the final stage where you're now fully recovered and you no longer night eat, nor do you have the desire to do it. But what I see is often within the first year after recovery, you sometimes have fleeting thoughts of night eating, and often they just pass and you're able to go to bed or go back to sleep and stay there. So that is really the first thing I want everybody to know who has night eating syndrome, is that there's six stages of recovery. And recovery never really happens like flipping a switch. Usually what I see, and this is probably for 95% of people, usually recovery happens in these 6 stages. And learning about what stage you're in and celebrating the small successes as you're moving through these stages of recovery helps you to rewire your brain for progress and success in your night eating syndrome recovery journey. Okay, so point number 2. The second thing I want everybody to know who has night eating syndrome is that one of the root causes of night eating syndrome is a period of calorie restriction, either in the past or continued on in the present. So some of you may have heard about the Minnesota starvation experiment, where they took a group of young, healthy men and they put them on a semi-starvation diet for several months. And what they discovered was that after these men went back into the refeeding phase, where they gave them all the calories again that they had prior to the starvation phase, they developed weird eating behaviors. So they didn't just lose weight and then regain the weight and were just normal. They actually developed psychobiological problems in terms of how they related to food. The changes were not just in the body weight, but actually in the brains of the participants. So there was a starvation-induced neural network formed that changed the relationship to food, even after returning to normal amounts of calories. And that often led to these men becoming binge eaters. Some of them even changed their careers to become chefs because they were just obsessive over food. Others had habits of looking at pictures of food all the time. Some of them would eat 3 times the amount of food they normally ate or they ate prior to the experiment in a single sitting. And so all of these things show us that when we go through a period of calorie restriction, there are actually brain changes that are happening that are not restored by simply eating enough calories. And so how does that relate to night eating syndrome? Well, usually I see a period of calorie restriction, yo-yo dieting, fasting, anorexia, or bulimia precede night eating syndrome. And that was actually the case for me as well. I actually had anorexia 2 years before night eating syndrome developed. And pretty much, again, like 99%, I want to say 100% of the clients that I've worked with over the past 6 years have had some form of yo-yo dieting, fasting, or other eating disorders that eventually led then to night eating syndrome. And I see that this switches the brain in a starvation feedback loop, which goes something like this. You restrict your food, and then your body, perceiving that restriction, starts hunting out of the survival mechanism for food at night. And then you overeat an excess of calories out of a perceived need to eat more because the brain thinks the starvation is happening again. The problem is that this starvation loop can persist even if you're back to eating your normal amount of calories, as the starvation experiment shows. And a lot of times I hear people say to me, I don't know why I'm still night eating because I'm eating my normal maintenance calories during the day, okay? And I'll come back to that in a second. But basically what we see here, what needs to be done is that our bodies and brains need to be put back in the safe zone in order for this starvation feedback loop to be interrupted. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So what does it mean when people tell me they eat their normal amount of calories during the day? Oftentimes what I see is that, unfortunately, they're not eating their normal amount of calories during their waking period. They're eating their maintenance calories in a 24-hour period, okay, plus some more. But they're still night eating. So oftentimes what happens is that people might be eating 80% of their maintenance calories from the time they wake up to the time they go to bed, but then they're still unintentionally and unbeknownstly to them saving up 20% for the nighttime. And that might be because they're not hungry to eat more. But what happens, even if it's just that small 20%, it fires up that starvation feedback loop. So the person ends up night eating. And then the second thing that happens is that the guilt and shame over night eating kicks in and over the weight gain associated with night eating. And that then leads to restriction and other compensatory behaviors like exercise, over-exercise. And you can see how the cycle kind of keeps going. And that, and so unless all of the 100% of the maintenance calories, and sometimes more, as the Minnesota starvation experiment showed, are put into the daytime portion of your eating, of your day of eating, night eating syndrome recovery is hardly ever possible. And one of the first things I always say to my clients is, well, what is your maintenance calories? Like, what are you eating now versus what do you think, what should you really be eating? Okay, so we kind of like work out like, well, this is how much you're eating and this is how much you should be eating based on your body and your activity level. And are you actually eating that during the day? Oftentimes, they're not eating all of that during the day. They're eating that in a short window and they're eating it way too late in the day. and they're topping up with more calories in the middle of the night. So to sum up that feedback loop, that NES feedback loop, it's basically a person night eats, there's guilt and shame over weight gain and night eating, the behavior. That then leads to restriction during the day and other compensatory behaviors. And then that restriction makes the body perceive that there's starvation, which then leads back to night eating. And so that's kind of that loop that needs to be interrupted. So in summary, caloric restriction in the past is one of the root causes of night eating syndrome and can often continue to be a problem even in the present, unless you put your body and brain back into that safety zone and let that feedback loop that we were talking about, that starvation, that NES feedback loop atrophy. And one of the first ways to do that is to make sure that you're eating your maintenance calories during the day. Of course, that's only one thing, that's not the only thing. And often caloric restriction continues into the present, okay? So sometimes people are just not eating their maintenance calories, and fixing that is going to be key. But other times, actually, people need to eat slightly more than their maintenance calories because their body has been so starved in the past, okay? And that is a case-by-case specific thing. And that is why it's always helpful to work with someone, because I know it can raise a lot of anxiety about weight gain. And it's really important to have somebody there to be able to monitor what you're doing in that quote-unquote refeeding phase, okay? Okay, so the third point, wow, we're really going through this quickly. I might throw in an extra point if we have time. So the third thing I want people to know is about the circadian rhythm of eating. So you guys might know that we all have a circadian rhythm. That is the rise of cortisol in the morning and the drop throughout the day and the rise of melatonin at night. So I also think that there's a circadian rhythm of eating, okay? People don't really refer to it as that, but I refer to it as that. And in a normal person, what we see is that their hunger hormone spikes in the morning, and then again at lunchtime, and then again in the evening, and maybe for a couple of snacks. But for night eaters, that curve is just very, very much pushed back, okay? So what we see instead is that a person's not hungry in the middle of the, in the morning, and their hunger probably spikes around lunchtime and then comes back again at dinner, maybe after dinner, and then in the middle of night, the hunger is in overdrive again. And so what we need to do for night eating is we need to rewire the circadian rhythm of eating, okay? 90% of calories are consumed in the later part of the day, about after 2 p.m. for night eaters. And in order to fix that, we need to put about 70% of daily calories before 4 p.m. Okay, so that's what I've found is the sweet spot with people. If we front load our days so that we can restore the natural fullness, the natural hunger and fullness rhythms of the day. So what does that look like practically? Of course, that looks like having breakfast in the morning and making sure that you are having breakfast early and not pushing it out. Because a lot of people say, yeah, I have breakfast. And then when I inquire more, they're having breakfast like 3 hours after waking up. No, normally what I recommend is that you have it within an hour of waking up. And then you want to make sure that you're having front loading the day by including snacks as well. So making sure that you have a snack between breakfast and lunch, and then having a good sized lunch, and then maybe another snack by 4 p.m. And that is usually how you end up rewiring over time. Obviously, you have to stay consistent with that, but over time, you rewire your circadian rhythm of eating so that you can then eventually not feel hungry in the middle of the night, but get those hunger cues early in the morning. And later in the day, your hunger is going to be less and less. And it's surprising how quickly this technique works with people, even just in terms of the distribution they see of eating throughout the day. And one of the main feedbacks I always get from like changing up your eating, making sure that you get 70% before 4 p.m. is that people just have so much more energy. And I think the sad part is that a lot of night eaters are just running on fumes most of the day. They're fueling themselves with coffee and they're not feeding themselves properly because they're so anxious about the weight gain. And so coming on to my fourth bonus point, I guess, well, we have time for that. Well, first of all, to summarize, rewiring your circadian rhythm of eating so that you're eating more in the early part of the day versus in the evening helps you rewire your hunger and fullness so that you're hungry during the day and not at nighttime. But I'll add this bonus point because it's very much related to the circadian rhythm of eating. And that is that it helps so much with your blood sugar balance as well, okay? And another piece or another core reason why night eating happens is because of a thing called nocturnal hypoglycemia. And nocturnal hypoglycemia is when our blood sugar drops in the middle of the night and catecholamines are released in our body. And those catecholamines basically are epinephrine, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and they wake our body up and they stimulate us. So we're already feeling this shakiness and the anxiety in the middle of the night and the hunger growling in our stomach. So if we have a blood sugar issue in the middle of the night, then we can't just fix it in the middle of the night. It's like with everything with NES. A good night starts with the morning, okay? It really does start in the morning. And so we need to fix it by having starting our day good, okay? And starting it with a blood sugar balanced way, okay? So that means not just living on coffee, making sure that you have a proper breakfast, making sure that you don't go too long between meals, because some people are like, well, okay, I have a big breakfast and then I'm not going to eat anything for 4 hours, and then we're going to have another big meal and not eat anything for 4 hours. And that might work for you eventually. Once you're recovered, all of these things can work. You can fast, you can do anything, but that's because you have let the NES feedback loop atrophy. But when you're still in the recovery phase, you need to pay attention to having stable blood sugars throughout the day, because that brings your brain and body in that safety zone where it doesn't feel like it's going to starve again. So I usually recommend having a snack in between meals. So that works out for eating every 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours. Okay. So, and then you want to make sure that you're eating the right things. So you're not eating just carbohydrates, but you're making sure that you're eating fats and proteins in order to keep your blood sugar stable. So just to summarize that bonus point that I wanted to give you guys, it's very much related to the circadian rhythm of eating, but it's just to make sure that you are not letting your blood sugar drop throughout the day. Okay. And that is achieved by making sure that you eat often, and you don't need to eat a ton all the time, but you need to eat snacks in between meals. So that's usually what I recommend. I usually recommend 3 meals and snacks in between those meals. And then sometimes, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, sometimes I do recommend a snack right before bed as well. It's particularly for people who have blood sugar issues, who have diagnosed hypoglycemia cases. Not everybody does, but a lot of times people do. The snack before bedtime can actually help maintain the blood sugar at night. And then you want to have a snack like a spoon of peanut butter versus, a piece of bread, for example, because that is the fat and the protein in the peanut butter is actually what keeps you stable throughout the night. But sometimes that snack before bed can just be a crutch. It can be temporary before you end up being able to get rid of that snack, and then you can return to just normally eating 3 meals a day with a couple of snacks. But the end goal really with night eating syndrome is not to overthink eating, right? The end goal is just to become an intuitive eater and to eat naturally, to eat what you're hungry for and to eat when you're hungry and to stop when you're full. So in a sense, all of what I'm saying today is to aid in the recovery journey. But where I always like to take my clients and where I want to point them towards is this picture of just becoming a childlike intuitive eaters. Children have this intuitive nature about themselves that they could have a plate of cookies and they could leave half of them there because they're just not hungry for more. Whereas somebody who has experienced a night eating syndrome or other eating disorder, they usually have such a tenuous relationship with food. And so once you've worked through a full recovery process, becoming more intuitive about what you actually feel you desire to eat, and what you what you're hungry for is something that we practice in order to finally achieve that childlike intuition again. So that's kind of the end of the formal part of what I wanted to say. I know I gave you guys a lot of information. It's often like drinking from a hose pipe, but I do hope that I managed to give you guys some helpful and useful tips in order to help you on your recovery journey. Just quickly wanted to say that if you are interested in one-to-one coaching, you can find me either on my Instagram. I have an Instagram that's it's entitled @Night Eating Syndrome Coach.